Yes, so thank you for the invitation. So today, as you can tell by the title of the talk, I'll be talking a lot about time. One of the things that drew me to this conversation that I'll try to have with you about time is that it is a very curious thing. It litters our life. We all have our phones with our alarms, our calendars, deadlines. Don't even get me started on deadlines. But whatever it is that we mean by discipline, even if we think of discipline in terms of morality or culture, I think, to use the technical jargon, a transcendental condition of understanding what we mean by discipline is myself. That was very eerie hearing myself. The conditional possibility for understanding what we mean by discipline is time. Whether that's understood, as being on time, whether that's understood as becoming mature, whether that's understood as how to order one's life, or whether that's understood as how to plan the totality of one's social existence. But the very strange thing about time, even though it seems inescapable, it seems almost paradoxically ahistorical. How we organize time, the meaning that it has, how time is expressed in our social activities actually varies quite a bit, socio-historically. And in fact, it seems for me, at least the argument that I am tending towards, if we want to understand something like agency, emancipation, and that grand jewel of freedom, we have to be talking about how our time is organized. To leave that to the side is to leave to the side, the very criteria we would want to have in order to understand that our society has been transformed radically differently than from what we already have. But the question becomes, where do we get this criteria? How do we understand how our time is organized, etc.? Those of you who know me know that I am a fan of Utopia. I think it gets a bad rap. I think, let me be polemical. I think most people don't delve much into it. They hear Utopia and they think, oh, the silly dreamers, impossibility, etc. Well, there's a rich tradition of utopian thinking, and it actually had very little to do with a perfect world, with the impossible, etc. It often had to do with critiquing a present state of affairs. The difficulty is, how do you critique a present state of affairs if you want to talk about transforming it when you live within those state of affairs? Some of my class is here for my racial and capitalism class, and we've been talking a lot about where do you get the normative or practical criteria of a different form of life when this is the only form of life you have known. So that's the broad scope of the type of argument I will be giving, and that's all prefatory. And so this is the actual talk. I want to begin by briefly discussing a curious ad I saw in the Toronto subway some time ago. It was an ad from an investment company, and there are graphs of arrows going up and down meant to intimate the rise and fall of the stock market, or what I think many of us would describe as its turbulence, or an anodyne term, it's turbulence. And over the picture of these graphs was a slogan, "Time in the market is better than timing the market." I love this. Capital advice, as I say. Whomever drew this marketing campaign could hardly have done better for drawing the critical eye of a Marxist theorist. In effect, what this investment company is saying is this. Yes, when I saw this, I was like, there's the talk. And I went home, wrote it up that night. Whomever drew this marketing campaign, in effect, what this investment company is saying is this. You do not control the market, but you can give yourself up to it profitably. Well, for some. I will come back to this image later in my lecture. So I will hope you'll forgive me for spending so much time on what seems to be a relatively silly ad. But one of the virtues of critical theory is being able to excavate the social logic that substands the things in our lives. And besides, I think that when capital speaks this directly to us, we should listen. Organizing a lecture around the theme of time might seem inauspicious when viewed in light of St. Augustine's famous claim, "What is time? When no one asks me, I know, but if I seek to explain to someone who asks me about it, then I do not." It's an incredible thing for a philosopher to say about this. However, my purpose here has little to do with giving you a metaphysical argument for what time essentially is. I'm evading that problem. Rather, I want to examine how we make use of time. Our practices and our practices and institutions, I will show, are intimately concerned with the value we give to time, its speed of relative change and constancy, and the ends we hope to accomplish in the finite amount of time that we are given. It should go without saying, the other thing that makes time, for me, so central to any critical theory, social practice, politics, is that is the one thing we know we have a finite amount of. There is no way of regenerating the amount of time we are given. And so what we choose to do with that time, it seems, is also an essential question of any type of agency. And so in his landmark essay, Time, Work Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism, E.P. Thompson argues that the transition into capitalism required violently overthrowing the tendency of peasants to organize their work around what tasks needed to be done, rather than how much value can be squeezed out of a finite amount of time. He writes, quote, "Those who are employed experience the distinction between their employer's time and their own time. And the employer must use the time of his labor and see that it is not wasted. Not the task, but the value of time when money is dominant. Time is now currency. It is not past, but spent." End quote. Thompson endeavors to show his readers that how we presently organize our time is not natural, but a product of social relations and practices that are historically specific. He even ends with a utopian proclamation, quote, "If the purposive notation of time use becomes less compulsive, how to fill the interstices of their days with enriched, more leisurely, personal and social relations, how to break down once more the barriers between work and life, to seek to rediscover modes of experience forgotten before written history begins," end quote. In effect, he's also saying, a transformation of our social relations, we would also have to learn how to use our time differently. I love this language use of, I forgot to read this section because I skipped a line, but you can see it up there, that men might have to relearn some of the arts of living lost in the Industrial Revolution. I gather it was a long time ago, but there were a couple of readings I had you all do in preparation for this, and one of them was Mastered by the Clock, correct? And something that was really important, I believe in the reading I showed you, I presented to you, is that one of the harms, the violences of slavery, of course, is the coercion, of course, it is the subjugation, etc. But also it was the theft of time. It was a theft of what we might call free time to develop one's capacities, develop one's social relationships, etc. And so what Thompson is pointing to here, the reason why I call this utopian, is not because he's pointing to some sort of perfect world. What he's pointing to is the idea that how we naturally think we have to organize our time now will no longer obtain. And I will come back to this in the lecture. It turns out a lot of what we think of is impossible or utopian is rarely impossible as such. It is often impossible vis-a-vis a set of assumptions and social relations we assume are inescapable. Notice that Thompson's method of critical inquiry here is a double movement between an analysis of what makes a social formation distinct, the limits in which it operates, and a prospecting look toward what it would mean to go beyond those limits. Critical theory, I think, is composed of just these diverse temporalities. It is both anchored in the present and seeks to unmoor itself for a freer, more emancipated future. I'll return to this point later in my lecture, but for now I want to offer the hypothesis that critical theory is at its best when it is non-contemporaneous with the present. My thinking is that critical theory is a distinctively temporal orientation to the historically specific social relations that organize our time. Though it is not the focus of my lecture, I believe this insight could also allow us to reformulate that age-old question of the relationship between theory and practice. However, rather than presuppose what makes critical theory critical, I want to demonstrate for you what I take to be the productive and necessary relationship between critique and utopia. As you are no doubt aware, utopia and Marxist critique have historically had an awkward relationship to one another. On the one hand, one can find passages in Marx, Engels, and Lenin denouncing the danger or superfluousness of utopia for radical theory and politics. On the other hand, you can also find Marx and Engels praising certain aspects of the utopians of their time, or offering glimpses of what life could be beyond the reign of capital that may seem utopian to us. I think much of the debate has suffered from the imprecision and ambiguity of the concept of utopia that lends itself to easy dismissals and polemics. Utopia is often collapsed into whatever a given utopian writes. And if one can show that an individual utopian has come to illogical conclusions, then it seems we are justified in claiming that utopia thereby is illogical. I hope when I put it that way, you see that that's actually not very good argumentation. Finding an instance of something and saying that that characterizes the general phenomena, you need much more than being able to show that, say, Proudhon said some silly things. More often than not, I think the habit of denouncing utopia via appeals to the denunciations of Marx or Engels tends to mistake historically contextual disputes between individuals as if they were trans-historical claims about utopia as such. We risk uncritically freezing a moment in time as an example of what utopia is, rather than explicating what it does. Put another way, the tendency to focus on the content of individual utopians' prescriptions obscures the methodological form of utopia. Utopias emerge not only as alternatives to our present state of affairs, but as a critique of an entire social totality. In practice, utopia always functions as a lens for glimpsing an alternative organization of social life that appears impossible. But this experience of the impossible drags into view the often implicit and naturalized organization of our society. Critical theory can have emancipatory effects when it reveals that what is taken to be impossible as such, say, time not being organized through the speed and tempo of market exchanges, are in reality impossible vis-a-vis as it concerns an historically specific form of life. In other words, impossibility is often judged from the temporally situated standpoint of the present. I will come back to this formulation near the end. Following the methodological form of utopia, we can see that the critique of critical theory is much more than analyzing what is bad or wrong in our form of life, but establishing the limits of this form of life. To establish the critical limits of our society is to both grasp our condition as a whole and, most crucially, understand our form of life as a form of life that is historical rather than eternal. Critical theory elucidates what is fundamental for organizing our form of life in this particular shape, such that if those fundamentals were to be changed or overcome, we could say that the entire totality has been transformed. Thus, critical theory is not only normative, but investigative, insofar as the interest in emancipation means that we must be interested in discovering what differences will make a difference for the realization of social freedom. I think that's important. What difference will make a difference? Because part of what I think is important about utopia and the transformation of how we discipline our time is that changes and reforms can happen every day, but we want to know what it is. Sometimes I use this language of logic, and to be more clear, what I mean by logic is what are the necessary defining features of a given form of life, such that if those features no longer obtain, we would say that that form of life is different. So to use a silly example, just because new people are born every day does not mean that we no longer live in a form of life marked by capitalist social relations. That is a difference. That is novelty, etc. That probably doesn't get at the essential features that mark this form of life as something different from, say, past forms of life or possible future forms of life. But isolating the difference that makes a difference is not always clear. Much denial of utopia from Marxist critical theory assumes that the prospective work of utopia consists in demanding radical changes that are either unlikely or impossible. But there's an alternative way we can understand prospecting. We should think of utopian critique as the activity of prospecting or sifting through the material of the present in search of alternative pathways out into a qualitatively different future of freedom. This would mean, contrary to critics of utopia, that when taken together, critiquing utopia are imminent movements that attempt to break through the ossified, or more precisely, reified crust of our moment. A critical theory of utopia, as I've articulated, self-promotion, as I've articulated in my forthcoming book, Race, Time, and Utopia, go buy it whenever it's on your bookshelf. Is a of progress and scale has been disciplined and defined in our current socioeconomic configuration, as well as outlining the principles of a future society no longer bound to the defining features of our present. We might think of this as the practice of undisciplining social time. However, you will note that the title of my lecture leaves this as a question because I think we should be reticent to think of a form of life where our time was absolutely undisciplined as either desirable or possible. Before making this point, I want to return to the ad slogan, "Time in the market is better than timing the market," in order to elaborate what I take to be the fundamental features of time discipline in capitalist societies. On the one hand, all of us know very well what this clever ad campaign means. It is not aimed at the median subway rider, but those with disposable income to invest. And to these people, it tells them that their time could be used more wisely by refusing to keep their money outside of the market. They should give up the vain and also not very lucrative fantasy of thinking they can know the exact right point to invest and sell, if only. That seems to be one of the constant spontaneous ideologies of our time. Yeah, you'll always know when you need to sell, when you need to buy. One of you shaking your head, I guess you're an investor, No, I'm totally joking. Instead, their money should be in the market for the long haul, throughout its ups and downs, enjoying that dynamic sameness of the social logic that Mark described as MCM prime, or money, commodity, more money. On the other hand, there is a banal yet unintended truth to this slogan. See, that's the thing about immanent critique. It's never wholly false. So there is something true about this slogan, insofar as the totalizing movement of capital means that few of us have a choice but to be in the market. Most of existing humanity, by force or by choice, will live much of their lives in the market through employment, housing, whether you're renting or buying, though I gather nowadays you're renting, and consumption. In fact, the social relations of our world are such that any time spent outside the market, again, scare quotes, any time spent outside the market is not only a misuse of one's time, but it is time wasted. That's sort of that normative language of it being wasted. That's not me. That's me describing how the world is. Time wasted searching for a job, searching for housing, finding sources of nutrition. Those that James Boggs called the outsiders and Marx analyzed as surplus populations, who are either prevented from having regular access to the formal labor market or are fully locked out of it, are people, from the standpoint of capital, from whom little value can be extracted. And unluckily for these people, the development of one's time is increasingly premised on the development and movement of the accumulation of capital. The unemployed, the indebted, the imprisoned, and the irregular workers might be conceptualized as spatially distinct from those of us who have the good fortune to live in the market. They are on the outside, we are on the inside. They are over there, and we are over here. The problem with the spatial metaphor is that it might obscure what the Marxist philosopher George Lukács called the totality of capital. Our critique might implicitly assume that unfreedom and domination are reserved for those left outside the process of capitalist development, and thus the task must be to enmesh them further into capitalist social relations. We live in a contradictory society, so what you should not hear me saying is actually those who don't have access to the formal labor market, they have the best lives possible while we are the drudgery drones who go to the office. No, to live in a contradictory society means that on the one hand, development seems to be premised on capitalist investment. On the other hand, this does tend to increase the possibility of exploitation, the possibility of deindustrialization, the possibility of further immiseration. Part of what I am talking about here is there aren't actually easy solutions to this. To live in the totality where so much of time is disciplined in this way, it means that, yes, there is good. But to look at the good abstractly separated from the bad, sometimes people will do it this way. Sure, the market, is volatile, but those are market failures. Instead, look on the sunny side of it. It's like, look at these iPads you get. You couldn't have had those in the 19th century, which, fair. If that is how we're judging society, you win that argument. It's not very compelling to me, though. Instead, What we must grasp is how capital inescapably disciplines everyone's time. It constitutes the very backdrop against which we organize our personal lives, our institutions, our societies. The quote, stillness in motion, that's a quote from Sewell, I believe actually. Nope, but in one of these slides it comes up. The stillness in motion that Marx characterizes as MCM prime, this implacable logic of capital draws in and shapes all the various forms of time that constitute our social life. As Marx claims in a footnote to the Working Day chapter of Capital, quote, the nature of capital remains the same in its developed form as in its undeveloped form, end quote. This is what Lukács is driving at in his analysis of reification. Capital admits no outside to its pressures and distortions, such that even life outside the market is decidedly not life beyond capital. Thus, from the standpoint of time, we might provisionally stipulate a point of unity around which class politics might be organized. As desirable as this might be, I think we will find that the time of capital does not admit easy political answers. One of the core tensions of capitalist temporality is that it reproduces a social dynamic of unity and contradiction. What increasingly binds the world together, that silent compulsion of MCM prime, also undermines social bonds, political institutions, and even ecological flourishing. Ernst Bloch, one of the most prominent Marxist philosophers, Utopia, called this Ungleichzeitigkeit. That's the German. It's translated sometimes as non-simultaneity or non-contemporaneity. I'm sticking with non-contemporaneity for the purposes of this talk. Bloch famously writes in this book called Heritage of Our Times, and most of the book is basically him trying to understand what made fascist Nazi Germany possible. And he famously opens that book, or opens one of the central chapters with, quote, not all people exist in the same now. They do so only externally through the fact that they can be seen today, but they are thereby not yet living at the same time with the others. Depending on where one stands physically, and above all in terms of class, he has his times. But what if, through the continuing effect of ancient peasant origin, for instance, as a type from earlier times, the peasant does not fit into a very modern concern, end quote. The relationship of class positioning to divergent temporalities is one of the key insights of Bloch's critical theory that I wish to adapt for our present purposes. In essence, he is saying that the critical theory of capitalist society cannot content itself with the mere appearance that we all live under capitalism. It must also examine how capitalist society allows some to advance and forces others to regress. Or put differently, how some forms of life are encouraged and others are rendered obsolete. Bloch insisted that Marxist politics had to reckon with the social pathologies of a pluritemporal society. Looking at Germany in the 1920s to 1930s, Bloch tried to explain the rise of fascism through the temporal alienation of uneven development in capitalist production cycles. The rise of new industries and the increasing centralization of wealth in cities disrupted the existing rhythms of rural life through impoverishment, technical innovation, and the promulgation of new social norms that have the capacity to keep up with the speed of capitalist development. Those of you who've taken other classes with me know that I enjoy teaching Hayek. Hayek would actually look at how capitalist development disrupts peasant and rural life and looks at the chaos of it, while Bloch says that creates the conditions of really reactionary regressive politics. Hayek will say, yes, so much the better. They don't know what progress needs, and that's what has to happen to them. And Hayek is really nice about this in the Constitution of Liberty. He goes, and of course it seems like an injustice to them, but they have to be moved in order for progress to happen. So it's also fascinating to me that two figures with radically different politics can look at this, see the same phenomenon, but one thinks absolutely that's what progress demands, and the other thinks that this is actually eviscerating progressive social relations. So I say that in order to those of you who are not Marxists, which is completely fine, to say that it is not only Marxists who see that capitalist development tends to dislocate social life. And in fact, a lot of pro-capitalist arguments are, that's good. How else are you going to get people out of those backwards ways of living? So the social dynamics of time in the countryside, people's expectations for how life was supposed to go, their normative sense of progress was increasingly uprooted and chained to the abstract and turbulent movement of the accumulation of capital. Block insists that such temporal changes rarely happen peaceably and often create the feeling of being displaced or no longer at home in the present. How much time do I? Oh, I have 20 minutes. Yeah, I'm good on time, right?
Yeah.
So it's so the quick thing I want to say of what Block is doing here is that he looks at this temporal dislocation not in order to say we need to go back, but he's trying to say the desire for a return to a blood and soil. He thinks needs to be explicated by these anarchic relations of capital, uprooting these lives and developing a sense of homelessness and a sense of being displaced. Part of his argument here is also faulting communists for not grasping these utopian energies and redirecting them in a different way. But I think he's trying to make an argument of I don't want to slip too much into contemporary concerns, but he's trying to make an argument of what type of politics you can expect to see in a society increasingly marked by disarray, tumult, etc. Block focuses on three groups of people in his analysis: the rural peasantry, the middle class, and the youth. The youth, Block notes, are often disposed to hunger for a state of affairs different than the present. He observes that, quote, the condition of 20-year-olds is rather devoted to a different life from the reified life of today, end quote. No doubt this is often a source of tension between what we call generations, as the young often rebel against what they take to be the ossified norms of the older generation. Many of you are younger than me in this room. I'm sure you have this feeling of looking at the older generations and seeing how they spoke, the art that they consumed, how they think about politics. You think that can't be us. Move aside. The future is here. Now that I am older, though not much older, to mind you, there is a sense of being like, whoa, hold on. This has worked for a long time, and you just got here yesterday. And so there's even this experience of temporal alienation. I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong. I'm just saying that Block thinks that that's actually been a longer dynamic than simply for you all. So you're at home with all these other 20-year-olds. Conversely, older generations, indeed, often, society as a whole, respond by trying to discipline the bloom of youth into a maturity that can endure the hard constraints of the real world. We might look at how schools educate students in the essentials of modern life through reading, writing, and math, to name a few. Beyond the curriculum, we can examine the role of the schedule, how the day is broken up into periods where students must move between classes in a timely and orderly fashion. I don't know if it's still like that in schools. It's been a very long time, but I assume there's still schedules and blocks and all that. Another source of time discipline can be found in tests that assess whether a student is reading at a 5th grade level or whether they have fallen behind. None of this is to imply that schools are essentially nefarious and should be abolished. I'm thinking about that type of meme of Foucault, where everywhere he looked, he saw prisons. School is a prison, hospital is a prison. I'm not necessarily going that far, okay? So I'm not talking about abolishing schools. But none of this implied that schools are essentially nefarious, so that, and they should be abolished so that time can become completely undisciplined and free for the youth. My God. Instead, I wanted to demonstrate that we can make sense of how an institution like the school works as a form of life by attending to its temporal structures. In fact, my argument is stronger. Temporal structures are an essential object of critique for conceptualizing a form of life. But my point here is that youthful enthusiasm for the new and for the future always comes up against the inertia of the present and the expectations that have been transmitted from the past. Now, when we look at these temporal structures of the school, we can see that the organization and assessment of the developmental ends of education are anything but natural. These are normative decisions concerning the skills and training the young will need to become self-sufficient, contributing members of society. If you like, you can prefer to think of the educational system as mostly concerned with training students to become civically minded citizens in the time of the nation. But I also think we can admit that at some point, these schools will also ask, what will these students do for a living? When we look at the political economy of universities in the United States, we find a constant discourse with how universities are preparing students for the needs of the new economy. This discourse attends a long decline in funding and support for the humanities as universities increasingly turn their attention to STEM fields. Again, no shade to STEM fields. I'm glad y'all are securing the bag, as it were. But notice that this shift is not only quantitative. It qualitatively suggests where one should spend their time in order to get the best bang for their buck. It suggests which forms of time have objective value vis-a-vis the objective needs of the economy. Just a quick story. When I was in school, I was a creative writing major. My mom, she went into corporate life and she kept saying, please, whatever you do, you can do creative writing, but be a business major, at least double major. I fell in love with philosophy, and I called my mom in my 4th year. I was like, Mom, I'm double majoring. She said, oh, thank God. And I go, I'm double majoring in creative writing philosophy. And she's just silent for a very long time. And in many ways, it's almost like, capitalism is personified in my mother in this memory. She's silent, and it's not even like she's angry. It's like she finally sees it for the first time. She goes, oh, you want to be poor. Okay. She's like, I misunderstand your expectations for yourself. All right, okay. And then she actually didn't even believe that I could get a job as a philosopher until the University of Toronto offered me a job 2 years ago. And she was like, so it's an internship? No, I'm being paid the salary. That you can live on? Yes. It's like, wow. I don't know how you swung that, but okay. Describing the economy as having needs, as having objective requirements for it to grow into the future, performs a double trick of presenting the economy as a living subject like you and I, and configures the economy as a mere fact of nature that we must synchronize our time with. But what we call the economy is neither of these things. It is a complex of capitalist firms, investment streams, and laws emerging from states, class struggle between workers and owners, and a constant relationship to the natural resources of the planet. All of these variables have their own temporalities, tempos, and speeds that rarely align and yet do comprise a unity or a totality. And youth, that site of potential and as yet undisciplined time, is inserted into these already existing temporal structures. The problem, of course, is not the mere existence of past structures, but the logic that disciplines these structures. And this logic, to repeat myself, is the constant and repetitive accumulation of capital that Marx denotes as MCM. It is hypothesized as the necessary source of value for all other social values we may have. And here I cannot help but think of the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, who claimed at the beginning of the pandemic that grandparents such as himself would happily sacrifice themselves to go back to work and keep the economy open for younger generations. Man, that, I don't know too much about psychoanalysis, but when I heard that, I was like, oh, is that the death drive speaking? Incredible stuff. Sacrifice yourself on the altar of this thing called the economy. I'm glad many elderly people did not make that choice. The time of capital can never stop, lest the entire society be thrown into crisis again. That's what it means to live in a contradictory society. The circulation of capital has no end. But its only end, and by end I'm playing on both telos and stopping point. Its only end is constant growth. William Sewell insightfully notes that in abstraction, the temporality of capital, quote, violates the most fundamental of assumptions of eventful temporality because for it, time is in effect reversible, end quote. For the individual human being, for political institutions, and social life more broadly, events leave their mark. Those of us who have experienced the pains of no longer being in our 20s know that we cannot simply become young again. And similarly, societies that experience revolutions and upheavals cannot simply decide to go back to the way things were. Sewell goes on to explain, yes, of course, quote, of course, the time of capital is irreversible for the individual capitalist, the failure of whose investment may cast them out of the capitalist class, or for the local community, which may be devastated by the loss of a major employer, or be transformed by an influx of wealth and population when a new industry arises. But the individual capitalist, if we take Marx as our guide, is merely the bearer of the social relations of capital, end quote. This is what I mean by unity and contradiction. It is not just that a society dominated by capital tends to pit different classes and forms of life against each other according to the principle of competition that generates growth and innovation, but the very temporal structures of capital contravene the temporal structures of political, social, and ecological forms of life. Does this mean that the time of capital is the only time there is? Of course not. Indeed, our society could only be Ungleichzeitigkeit, non-contemporaneous, because we have various practices of organizing and valuing our time. This fact is a constant source of increasing tragedy and tumult for individuals and society as a whole. For instance, to return to Bloch, we can see how he analyzes middle-class life in the cities as organized around expectations and rhythms of constancy and stability. But these expectations of normal family life, where one's children are left better off because they assume positions in the family business or inherit the accumulated wealth of their parents, was constantly dashed against the rocky turbulence of capitalist expansion as businesses went under, trades changed, and markets crashed. I leave to the side the gendered expectations of bourgeois families, but needless to say that this would have to also be included in any complete analysis of our form of life. But how goes things now in middle-class life? By some reports, what we call the middle class is far more indebted with mortgages and credit cards, and because of this, they are staying in the labor force longer, on top of working longer hours. Younger people are having a harder time finding stable careers as the needs of the market constantly change, and are having a harder time breaking into the housing market. As a joke, I found this meme. When you realize you should have bought an investment property after the 2008 market crash instead of being 9 years old. Sometimes you missed your moment. I don't know what to tell you. And remember, time in the market is better than timing the market. What this means, if the ad I analyzed at the beginning is right, is that younger generations are losing time the longer they are outside the market. And this lost time means other parts of life are delayed or disrupted. One of the more ossifying symptoms of life in the time of capital is that the expectations of the past retain their grip on the present, even as capital has revolutionized or made obsolete the social relations that gave rise to those expectations in the first place. Hence, the constant anxiety from social conservatives over the loss of the traditional family is both misplaced, they think it's a problem of culture, and contradictory insofar as it often retains a defense of the temporal logic of capital. Melinda Cooper's family values between neoliberalism and new social conservatism is invaluable on this score. Harmut Rosa argues that the social relations of modern society are typified by, quote, the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, end quote. And as such, politics, understood as a vehicle of autonomy and the self-conscious direction of society, is increasingly incompatible with the incredible speed of capitalist time. He claims that, quote, the aggregation and, I thought you all would have the quote there. Oh, no, I meant to show you that. This was about delayed expectations. But here we go. The aggregation articulation of collective interests and their implementation democratic decision-making remains time-intensive. For this reason, democratic politics is very much exposed to the danger of desynchronization in the face of more acceleratable social and economic developments, end quote. I would specify that this is a potential symptom of life dominated by the time of capital rather than modernity, but we can talk about that in the Q&A perhaps. Not to avoid any misunderstanding, I'm not claiming that having children in the bourgeois family is an unconditional good that allows us to evaluate the lives of others. Some people do not want to have children, for instance, and there's nothing wrong with organizing one's time in line with those values. My critical point is to diagnose the lack of control we have over organizing the temporality of capital. One of the utopian promises of modern politics was the creation of institutions that would allow people to govern themselves. Now this was accomplished, to varying degrees, through the creation of deliberative bodies such as the legislature and judiciary that could slow the tempo of political decision-making that arises either from the capricious passions of the mob, as conservatives in the United States never tire of reminding us, the founders never meant to create a pure democracy of rule by the people, but a constitutional republic. There's a whole saying in the said thing, it feels like they're saying something more there than just simply giving us a history lesson. It seems to me they're saying something about, no, there are only certain people who are fit to participate in democracy, not everybody. Or, these institutions are meant to protect the people from the arbitrary desires of the sovereign. In a sense, we can already see how, taken on its own terms, this form of politically disciplining time will become prone to crisis and dysfunction. After all, we might think that there are some political problems whose time horizon does not match the institutional framework of many states, or political events whose speed does not accord with the tempo of lawmaking. Take two contemporary examples. On the problem of mismatched temporal horizons, we can look at the ongoing ecological crisis of our planet that not only requires far-reaching changes in how we organize production, but these political changes must be implemented over a long period of time throughout multiple governments. Given that election cycles range from every 2 to 6 years, there's always a chance that progressive policies put in place during one governmental cycle will be repealed once a new government takes over. Add to this the necessity of multiple national governments synchronizing their policy goals with one another, even as they must contend with the tempos of their own national populations, then you can see why there is an imminent stumbling block between our form of politics and addressing our shared ecological crisis. And to think I've not even touched on the imperatives of limitless accumulation that capital imposes on all societies. I can't help but think of the image of world leaders at the COP summit throwing coins into the Trevi fountain in Rome to wish themselves good luck in coming to an agreement on how to repair an environment. When I saw this was a moment of complete disillusion for me. These are ostensibly some of the most powerful people in the world, and they're relying on throwing random coins into a pond. Like, I really hope someone takes care of this. Like, you, who else but you? But, again, they have all their national interests, etc. And I think that was probably them being realists. What better expression of political non-empowerment than this image? If not them, then who has the power? Ungleichzeitigkeit takes on a new dimension beyond even what Bloch had conceptualized. After all, it is not as if nature waits for us to deliberate. Nature does not cast a vote alongside us, recognizing the need to be patient, the slow boring of politics. If only nature had read Max Weber, I guess. Nature is composed of its own temporalities that as yet have not been entirely subsumed by our disciplinary control. Perhaps this puts to rest the hope that nature will eventually someday become the uncontested dominion of human control. Or rather, we are going to have to rethink how we synchronize our practices with the limits and demands of nature. Well, when we consider the mismatched tempo of political events, we can look at the confrontation between mass protests that, according to Sheldon Wolin, introduce, quote, frenetic, disruptive tempos, end quote, and the slowness of traditional deliberative bodies. The line between legitimate protests and untimely revolts are increasingly blurred by modern governments that seek to constrain the space of disagreement in the political arena. Governments seek to discipline the speed of protest by either binding them to the temporality of ordinary politics through imperatives to vote or run for office. My favorite moment of 2020, there are vanishingly few, as you might imagine, was at the beginning of the George Floyd protests, the Democratic Party with their kente scars, kneeling. Unclear what that has to do with George Floyd, but I get the message, which is rather than doing all that protesting, you could just vote for the people who know something vaguely about African culture. I don't know, I think politics will never be better than that. Or if binding the temporality of protest to ordinary politics doesn't work, there's the strategy of imposing legal penalties such as fines or imprisonment. We need look no further than the use of RICO and domestic terrorism charges against protesters battling the creation of Cop City in Georgia. And I'm not just playing on the word, but I think it is important that fines, jail time, imprisonment, that we do use the phrase of doing time. That is a way of stealing a type of time, but also it's important that it disrupts the tempo of a new sensibility that might be emerging or a new sensibility of democratic demands. In other words, political discipline is imposed by disrupting the temporal structure of unruly protest by taking time back. No doubt much of this is often craven and manifestly unjust, but I think this should not allow us to lose the critical insight that the temporal structures of our political institutions really are out of sync with the speed of some political events. This inertia cannot simply be wished away. It has to be reckoned with. One might respond to examples like these in the spirit of Winston Churchill and say, quote, democracy is the worst form of government except all the others that have been tried, end quote. Please do not become Winston Churchill. But to do so would be to completely disavow what critical theory can do, and I hope you now see, demonstrates what a complete disavowal of utopia produces. Without utopia, we tend to naturalize the disciplinary constraints of our present as if all possible societies will have this form of non-synchronicity. But the point, or non-contemporaneity, but the point of critical theory is not only, just 5 more minutes. But to do so, without utopia, we tend to naturalize the disciplinary constraints of our present as if all possible societies will have this form of non-synchronicity. But the point of critical theory is not only to understand this world, but to transform it. However, changing the social relations of our life will always run up against the problem that what presently exists always appears more plausible and necessary than what has not yet come to be. The double movement of critique in utopia, by establishing the limits of the temporal structures of our present society, should allow us to put these limits in question, thus allowing alternative forms of temporal organization to be illuminated beyond the horizon of our present. Marx captured the disjunctive experience of modernity between the incredible revolutionary speed of capital, all that is solid melts into air, and the relative slowness of traditional politics. No doubt this is what led him to prospecting how the proletariat would, of necessity, need to bring the time of politics to bear on the seemingly uncontrollable dynamic of capitalist production. Marx captures some of this dynamic in his analysis of struggles over the length of the working day in capital. From the perspective of capital, the time of the workers, it's incredible, the working day chapter. You even have capitalists debating what is the proper anthropological age of children when they should be first allowed into factories. Again, I think that this also brings clearly into light even what we call as the separation between childhood and adulthood, rarely natural, often up to contestation and historically contingent. From the perspective of capital, the time of the workers should be extended as far as humanly possible. But from the perspective of many proletariats, their time held alternative values that would be crushed by the imperative to work long hours in dangerous conditions. Pressure builds on the English Parliament to legally restrain the voraciousness of capitalists without also thereby completely disrupting the temporal process of accumulation. Marx envisioned a form of social emancipation that would suspend the uncontrollable and turbulent dynamic that capital imposes on our form of life. But note that he does not envision this new form of life arbitrarily, but traces out the conceivable consequences of the proletariat no longer being dominated by the relentless alternation of capital's accumulation cycle. He sifts through existing elements of the present to highlight nascent forms of time organization that could replace the time of capital. Such an imminent analysis is utopian, insofar as it begins to outline what life beyond capital could mean. Naturally, nothing guarantees that this will be successful, or even if it were guaranteed, it is not assured that such a transformation will happen within the temporal horizons of possibility. To return to my phrase of the standpoint of the present, we have to acknowledge that our time, in crucial aspects, is different than when Marx wrote. A workers' movement does not appear to be on the immediate horizon in the way it had when Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. The experience and discipline of belonging to a revolutionary political organization is foreign to many of us. And the legitimacy of the state's organization of time seems inescapable, even if dissatisfaction is on the rise. I'd venture to say that our moment is afflicted with a persistent sense of political sclerosis. The political institutions of our moment seem increasingly brittle and inert vis-a-vis both political events and the ongoing disciplining of capital's accumulation. Strikingly, this gives rise to the paradoxical experience of everything changing so fast and yet feeling stuck. Such an experience can lead to feelings of despair and disempowerment. It might even suggest that the task of freedom is to completely undisciplined time, such that there are no more constraints and time can be left to unfold naturally for each and every one of us. I think that this would be both a theoretical and practical mistake, hence the question mark on the title of my lecture. What is salient for critical theory is not whether our time will be disciplined or not, but how we discipline the various demands and constraints in our time. Every existing society, I think, will have to organize its time according to certain values in order to persist and make sense of itself. I think that is a necessity. What is not a necessity is that our time must be disciplined and organized by the tempo of capital accumulation. If action and freedom require both time and autonomy, then I hope to have shown that the abstract logic of MCM prime irrevocably alters the form that action and freedom can take. My stronger intuition is that action and freedom is imperiled by having the temporal structure of our lives increasingly subsumed by the dynamics of the capitalist global market. The cruel irony of market time is that one of the main justifications for capitalist markets is their dynamic efficiency in being sensitive to the changing needs of consumers in conditions of scarcity. And yet what we find in our moment is recalcitrance and the refusal that life could be different, that the values and organizations of time may more fruitfully depart from the value of accumulation. The strategy of attempting to ameliorate the crisis of our time while keeping the role of capital fixed is paying fewer and fewer dividends. The hope that the state can harness the time of capital to the political horizons of a contemporary moment appear, to me, to be pejoratively, rather than critically, of the pejoratively utopian wish of our era. Our moment is one of immense turbulence. Coalitions of the past and expectations for the future decomposing, recomposing right before our very eyes. But for all that turbulence, our moment is also one, it seems to me, of great stagnation. Dominant political institutions that were successful in the prior moment seem to be increasingly unable to cope with the pressures and challenges to their temporal structures. However, between this turbulence and stagnation, I think we can find prospects for alternative pathways to freedom. Strikes in various sectors, such as the art and auto industry, tells us that collective action of unions may have receded, but are far from dead. Belief in the cogency of certain policies of our governments are no longer taken for granted, and thus space is opened up for undisciplining and then redisciplines the social constraints of our moment. Critical theory must endeavor to grasp these prospects, analyze them, and make explicit their utopian potential for catalyzing the movement into a new time. It is possible to contest what I've said by claiming that I have not proven, nor is it plausible to think that all our problems are an expression of the temporal logic of capital. But I've made no such claim, and I would agree that a variety of abstract theory that contentedly sits back and says, you know, if you really think about it, it is just all capitalism all the way down. That doesn't tell us much. It doesn't actually establish any coherent politics. Instead, what I've tried to show is that capital places constraints on how we can solve the problems that we face. There's no need to assume that behind every social problem, you will find capital standing there with a smoking gun. But what we can say is that the radical reorganization of our time and freedom will be limited insofar as the needs of capital are thought to come first. Thus, we can begin theorizing a life beyond capital, not from the presumption that everything will be perfect, but how we organize our time of freedom, of work, of sociality will increasingly be based on what we can value and control rather than what is compelled by the blind process of unending accumulation. I believe that is a world worth fighting for, or at the very least, theorizing to better grasp our standpoint of the present. Thank you.